Hello and welcome to the Holistically Psyched podcast. I'm your host, Mariah Choate, a nationally certified school psychologist turned stay-at-home mom who now has the freedom to share what school districts don't want you to know after spending over a decade in the field of education. My goal is to help you learn all you need to know about special education that districts often gatekeep. Each episode will dive into how commonly laws are blatantly broken and tips on leveraging special education law to support best practice for students and teachers alike. We'll also feature interviews with parents and educators who are navigating these challenges head-on, along with those who are making strides to improve this broken system. This channel is for you, parents of students with suspected or diagnosed disabilities who already have or might need individualized education plans or 504 plans. It's also for teachers, counselors, and fellow school psychologists who are feeling the strain of a system that often leaves us feeling burnt out and overwhelmed. So if you're ready to learn, advocate, and empower yourself, child, or students, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to the Holistically Psyched podcast. I'm your host, Mariah Choate, and today we have a wonderful guest who will share her experience not only as a mom of a child with dyslexia, but also as someone who now has expertise to spot and advocate for children with dyslexia. As many of you know, dyslexia is often missed in the school setting in terms of IEP eligibility and even lack of teacher training. So we will get into that more today. Before we dive in, let me remind you that our mission here is to share both the good and the bad aspects of special education from individuals committed to making change within the system. We're here to empower parents and educators with the knowledge and skills to help them advocate for their children and students. So let's welcome our guest today, all the way from Hawaii, Michelle Henderson, who has firsthand experience with her child in the public school system. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. And to start, do you mind sharing a little bit about your journey through the initial IEP process and how the school handled things for you?
I'm so excited. I just feel giddy to have this opportunity to chat with you. And I've just really appreciated your content since I found you on Instagram. Also, I just feel like we share a mission in that we are advocating for parents and children to, be successful in school, which is such an important goal in life, and it really is so foundational for future success in everything. Let's see. I'll kind of give you the end story before I go back to the beginning a little bit. I'm really happy to say that my son, who was ultimately diagnosed with dyslexia at age 6, he's now in 5th grade and he's doing really well. And
Yay!
has been it's been a journey. It's been up and down, and it's been heartache and pain and successes and transformation. But I will say, to kind of give a little bit of a background on our story, really, it was actually this very time of year when he was in kindergarten. I was sitting down with his kindergarten teacher in our parent-teacher conference, and I was blindsided. At that point, I'd been an early educator for over 20 years, and I knew that he was struggling with letter recognition, and writing was really hard for him. And he also is a twin, so you know how we're not supposed to compare our children. It's really hard when they have a twin right next to them and supposed to be doing the same things, so to speak. And we all know that they all have their own individual trajectory, but at the same time, it was like, this is working for his twin, but it's not working for him. And what am I doing wrong? And I'm sitting there talking to his teacher, and his teacher says, mind you, this is in October. We have over 7 months of school left. And she says, he's not going to be ready to move on to 1st grade next year.
Wow.
And was blown away. It was in that moment I realized she's already given up on him. Rather than saying, hey, let's create an action plan. We are going to support him. Let's figure out what he needs. At that point, I was so stunned. I still kind of feel those emotions when I'm retelling this story. I feel a little bit speechless, like I don't even know what to say, because it was so surprising to me. And retention was not something that I was comfortable with. And I said, listen, we've got a whole school year. Like, what can we do to help him? And her response was, well, what we're doing at school is just not working for him. So you're going to need to teach him at home. I did not fully appreciate how weighty and heartbreaking that was, and like the emotional toll it took on me until I kind of really looked back and analyzed that years later. And then also just how wrong that was for a teacher to say that it was suddenly my responsibility solely. I've always been very involved in my children's education, and I was more than happy to say, okay, what can we do together? But it was really like, no, we've kind of given up on him. And so I really did start teaching him at home. But at that point, I wasn't a reading specialist, and I didn't really know how to teach my kids. And what I'd done with my older kids that worked for them wasn't working for him. So we kind of went through kindergarten, and then beginning of first grade, I finally had been doing tons of research, and I said, listen, I want to have him tested for special education. I'd been to a training a few months prior where the trainer had said something about dyslexia, and I knew some about dyslexia, but I definitely didn't know enough. And she said it has nothing to do with intelligence. She kind of listed a couple things, and in that moment, I just had this aha moment. I was sitting in this training, and I thought to myself, it really felt inspired. I thought to myself, my son has dyslexia. And I didn't know how I felt about that at that moment because I didn't know enough. And it was a label, and what does that mean for him and all these things. But it took me almost 9 months more asking teachers, asking principals from different various schools. I was actually working in a school at that point, asked that principal. It was a different school than my kids went to. Nobody could tell me how I might have my son tested for dyslexia. No one would tell me what I could do to help him. And the one thing that one of the principals from another school said was, you definitely don't want him in special education because that's just, where all the difficult kids are going to go. And he's far too smart for that.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So that scared me. So in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, I don't want that. Heaven forbid I should get him help, right?
Right.
And, this was also a time where I was honestly, my ego was preventing me from taking action because I feel like I'm an early literacy teacher. I'm an early educator. I've been reading to my kids since before they were born. And this is the one thing that we do right. In all the, mistakes that I make as a parent, my kids are readers and I know what I'm doing and I've always prioritized this. And now suddenly I have a struggling reader, and it was humbling. And I really had to swallow my pride. I remember over a few months, those first few months when I kind of had that inspired thought, like, he has dyslexia, and I started looking into it more. I didn't want to tell anybody. I didn't want to share his struggles. I just wanted to quietly remediate them at home, work with him a little bit, and then have it be a nice little package where it didn't make me look bad as a mom, right? I finally, thankfully, worked through that and realized this has nothing to do with you, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
Move on. This is about advocating for your child. We don't want other people to see our weaknesses as parents, especially when it's something that's so important to you. And I'm thinking to myself, I've dedicated my whole life to this. How could I possibly have a struggling reader? Well, I had to swallow my pride and move forward. And I'm so grateful that I was able to move past that, because you know what I found is the more that I shared my story, the more I realized how many families out there were struggling with the very same thing. They felt hopeless. Their child wasn't able to read. They weren't getting help at school. They didn't know what to do for their child. And some of them had kids that were much older than mine. And they'd been telling their teacher for years, I'm really concerned about their reading. Oh, and of course they would get the, he's so smart. Let's just wait and see how he does. Don't worry, he'll catch up. And that whole wait and see nonsense, right? Which is the biggest red flag and so unhelpful. The school put me off and said, you know what? We don't have any data that shows that he's struggling. His kindergarten teacher had left the school, so she wasn't there to corroborate but she had given him good grades. And so his grades were just fine. So we'll have to, see how he does and wait another quarter. And again, it was just this kind of like, let's put it off longer and longer. That whole wait to fail mentality, which was so infuriating to me. And I even said to the principal in our first meeting, I said, why can't we just assess him now so that he doesn't continue to get more frustrated? Because it was already becoming a very big frustration for him, and his behavior was being affected. And her response to me was very curt. And she said, that's just the way we do it. And I was very upset. I actually couldn't speak for the rest of that meeting. I didn't trust myself to say anything nice. And so my husband took over at that point this was a Zoom meeting, and while I was fuming and trying to keep it together, I just cried because I felt so hopeless. And so what did we have to do? Because I didn't know any better at that time. I just was like, well, I have no power. That's how they made me feel. The parent really doesn't matter what you say.
This is in the meeting to discuss if they're even going to take on the assessment or not.
Yes, exactly. And they put me off. I didn't even really fully understand why, but I just knew in my gut, this is wrong.
Yeah.
This is wrong, and my child is suffering because of it. And I don't really care if that's the way we do it, if it's not benefiting our kids, and that's just not a good answer. That's just not a good answer. But again, like I said, I didn't know any better back then.
And it's not a legal answer.
Amen. Right. I understand that now and feel like so much less emotionally charged because I know that I can say that and I know my rights. But, that's what it comes down to. We waited another quarter and he was just spiraling out of control, really. He wasn't progressing in his reading, but his bad behavior was definitely progressing. And I kept saying to his teacher and the school, listen, I understand his behavior is not ideal. And yet I know that these are symptoms of the actual problem that I've been talking to you about for over a year now. If we address the actual problem, those symptoms are going to go away. I felt like an island. They had a different reality than what we had. And to make it worse, like at home, my son was just falling apart emotionally. Every morning, getting him to go to school was this massive emotional meltdown. At school, they're saying, you know what, he needs a behavior plan. And I'm saying, that's just a symptom. We need to address the actual problem. After that quarter, they're like, okay, yeah, you're right. He hasn't progressed. We'll test him now. I'm like, okay, finally. I'm thinking, okay, now we're getting somewhere. Of course, the process takes a long time. And it was, hours and hours of testing. And in the end, the school psychologist said, you're right. He is behind in reading, writing, and spelling, those 3 areas that you expressed concern, but he's not behind enough. So we're going to just give him a behavior plan. I, again, was so frustrated in that meeting. I just knew that it wasn't right. And this is where I just say to parents everywhere, listen to your gut. If it's telling you this isn't right, it probably isn't. And in fact, I just read a quote earlier today from a really fabulous professional that's been in the field for over 40 years. And she said, in 40 years, I've never encountered a parent who had a feeling about their child's literacy who was wrong. Listen to your gut. You know your child best.
Yeah, I always say that. And was the behavior plan successful?
I mean, he had like a helper there, and that was helpful to a degree, but only because in retrospect, after we actually had him tested privately, discovered that he also has ADHD and attentive. So having that helper kind of mentor him along the way and kind of get him back on task and help him focus and transition and all those executive function skills that he struggles with, that was helpful, but he still couldn't access the instruction. And he's a very bright kid, and so it was overwhelming and so frustrating, for a full day. Can you imagine going to work for 8 hours a day and being asked to do the one thing that just makes no sense to your brain? They're not teaching you how to do it. And yet you look around at everybody and they seem to get it. They seem to know how to do it. What's wrong with me? And then doing that day after day after day. And then working really hard to try and figure out, only to be told, you really need to try harder. You're being lazy, really slacking.
Yeah. I can't imagine the frustration, like the helpless feeling of, I know that there's something wrong, and every single avenue that I'm going to try to get help, they're like, no, it's all in your head. And it's just his behavior now. So when did you get an outside assessment, and did you go back to the school and get a reassessment for an IEP?
Yeah, so they did their assessment and told us in December that he did not qualify for services. And that did not feel right to me. And over the holidays, I just sat back and said, what am I going to do? Because I can't leave it at this. This is not, I see a very bad trajectory for his life if I leave it at this. And that's when I started seeking a private evaluation. But again, even just asking people, how do I do this? I had a really hard time. Nobody knew. Nobody could tell me. Thankfully, I finally found somebody on the internet. There's like a dyslexia center on the island of Oahu. And the woman I spoke to there was fabulous. She runs the program and she was super helpful and so resourceful. And she did a screening on him for dysgraphia and then referred me to a psychologist in the area that did full neuropsychological evaluations, including the academic evaluations. And I was able to gratefully get an appointment there for him a few months later. And so that's what we did. And then, of course, that process takes a long time too, right? Waiting for the appointment. Then, I mean, for us, it was 4 appointments, 1 with the parents and then 2 with my child and the psychologist for a few hours each. And then a follow-up with the parents to kind of report data and findings. And then waiting for the actual official report, which ended up being like 16 pages long. And it's expensive. My husband and I are both educators, so it wasn't like, oh yeah, this is no big deal for us. But at the same time, I was like, we're rearranging our budget to make this happen because I feel like this investment is the only way to make progress for our kid. And so we did. I feel so grateful that I have that privilege to do so because so many don't. When I got that report, and actually when we spoke with the psychologist, I finally felt validated after almost 2 years, really, about a year and a half, a little over that. She said, he most definitely should have an IEP. He definitely is struggling with dyslexia and dysgraphia. And by the way, ADHD inattentive. And I was like, I hadn't even crossed my mind. And I didn't understand enough about it. I'm like, oh, he can focus on preferred activities. It's those non-preferred activities, right, that are so difficult. And then the transitioning and all those things, looking at all this data, which was a little bit like reading Chinese for me. I don't speak Chinese or read Chinese at first, but having her help me work through it. And then I was like terrified, to be honest, to take it into the school, but I was also adamant and I was going to advocate for my kid. But I took it in and I said, we had a neuropsychological evaluation done. Here's the report. We need to meet to discuss what we're going to do going forward. And the psychologist said something to the effect of, oh, okay, well, we'll look at this and see if this, if we need to do anything different. And I was like, oh, we absolutely need to do a lot of things different. Even with that report from the psychologist, it felt like a fight. I didn't feel like we were all on the same page or on the same team saying, what can we do to help this child? Finally, his 4th quarter of 1st grade, he had an IEP. Luckily, at that time, they had a 1st grade special educator at the school who was trained in the Orton-Gillingham approach, who was also just a fabulous educator. And really that whole 1st quarter of him, he was pulled out of his general classroom and put in there. Honestly, the thing that she did for that first quarter was help him feel welcome and safe at school again.
Hmm.
And one of the biggest things that I noticed was such a little thing, but every time he would come to her class, of course, it's a much smaller group of kids, and there's more teachers, and I would drop him off, and they would all greet him by name.
I love that.
Made all the difference for him just to kind of warm up to them, because honestly, up until that point, he hated going to school so much that he would run and hide in our yard every morning, and it was like I couldn't let go of him, or I didn't know, he would just take off. When he started going to her, they made him feel welcome, but then also they were teaching him in a way that made sense to his brain, and he felt successful.
Hmm.
And it changed his demeanor. It was like night and day.
Oh, good. And he qualified, was it under specific learning disability?
Yes, it was under specific learning disability with additional accommodations for ADHD.
I see. Yeah, and I want to go back because let's imagine that the school psychologist gave a person-centered, holistic approach the first time. There's a big possibility that she could have caught the ADHD and potentially given him an IEP under OHI, other health impairment. And even though that wouldn't necessarily have addressed specific accommodations for dyslexia, it would have provided the support and the validation from you to hear, okay, at least we're getting some type of support and we're going to monitor. That's what I always tell parents is even regardless of the eligibility that the child qualifies under, you don't necessarily need a specific eligibility category because you're able to at least get eyes on your kid.
Right.
So you might not get it right the first time, but you're getting an entire team of people that are going to be reevaluating, looking and monitoring, progress monitoring for goals, making sure accommodations are successful, trying to change them if they're not, right? That's a huge leg up from just a general education student. So with his new IEP, and it's under specific learning disability, that was from first grade, right? Now he's in fifth grade. So if you can talk a little bit about how that process has been since finding out he has dyslexia.
It was at that same time that I realized when we were going through all that, I needed to figure out how to advocate for him, because if I didn't do it, it was not going to happen. And frankly, I didn't know what to ask for. And I felt like I was floundering. And that's when I decided to go back to grad school and get a degree in reading science. It has changed my life and has changed his life for sure. And really our whole family. The biggest thing for me was understanding what effective reading instruction should even look like. Where before it was like I just assumed I was sending my child off to the professionals that were experts. Though I have to say, as far as our experience has gone, what I've learned over the years, and it was very surprising to me, is that despite teachers really wanting our kids to do well, and they have such great intentions, and they're working relentlessly and so hard. So many of our teachers, and I would venture to say most, have not been trained at all in dyslexia or
Right.
ADHD for that matter. And probably lots of other things too, but those are the things that I focus on, right?
Mhm.
And I have a lot of friends who are teachers, and a lot of my friends in my master's program cohort are classroom teachers, and they were frustrated because they did not feel prepared at all, even with many of them master's degrees in education. They did not feel like they were prepared to teach reading in an effective evidence-based fashion. They did not feel like they had been taught at all about dyslexia and how to help identify and remediate and inform parents and all that stuff. I always ask teachers, I'm like, how well did you feel prepared to teach reading? Did you have much training in your programs? And honestly, I hear, I didn't feel prepared. I was scared, and I was just like trying to figure out what to do because I really wanted these kids to succeed. And I had like one class on how to teach reading or a section of a class on how to teach reading
Oh
a
my goodness.
semester. And then, moreover, what I've discovered over the years is that so many teacher training programs are not teaching effective methods, and in fact, are teaching methods that have been debunked for decades. Luckily, my son's second grade teacher was super supportive and willing to collaborate with his special education teacher and with me. And I felt like I had a supportive team for the first time. The three of us collaborated and conferenced, and they gave one of the things I made sure and had in his IEP was regular weekly updates about his progress, because I didn't want them to just go along and get to the end and be like, oh, darn, you know what? He's still behind. And I wanted to be up on what was going on so that I knew that it was actually being monitored, because it hadn't been before, you know? And I also realized that, you know, teachers have so much that they're juggling. And really, I think many of them are grateful when you reach out and say, listen, I'm concerned. What can we do? Can we be in touch more? Can you let me know? This is what I'm seeing at home, that sort of thing. And so I really appreciated that from his teachers that year. And now he was feeling comfortable going to school and welcome and celebrated for his strengths. And he started to feel confident and started to really excel because he was being taught using the Orton-Gillingham approach. It was still slow. It was still slow progress. And I was now reading all this research about how important it is to have early intervention, and really that if kids aren't reading at benchmark at the end of first or second grade at the latest, that they often never catch up before the end of elementary school and often are struggling all through high school. And so urgency set in, and I'm thinking, he's in second grade. This year, we've got to get him caught up. And each year that goes on, the expectation is greater. So it's so challenging. I mean, early intervention is just so crucial. I can't say it enough. So at that point, you know, I think after the first semester of second grade, I realized he's not progressing quickly enough. We really have to make up time here with like a really intense intervention. And that's when I worked with her child. She worked with mine, because you may know this, and many parents have experienced this, that when you try to teach your own kid, it's much easier for them to be like, no, mom, not going to do that. I had one of my classmates who has a child with dyslexia. She and I swapped. That's when my son started receiving private tutoring 4 days a week after school with Orton-Gillingham trained tutor. And that's when he was getting it at school and he was getting it at home. Oh man, it was a fight every session. He did not want to do it. It was really hard, but it made a huge difference. And that's when he really started to progress. I will say too, as a side note to dyslexia, that really figuring out his ADHD and attentive was a huge key for him, because until we figured that out and got him the medication that he needed to help his brain focus, he was still struggling focusing. It was kind of a perfect storm. He couldn't focus, and it was already challenging for him. But as soon as he was able to focus, and then the effective instruction came in, then he was able to really start to progress leaps and bounds. It was almost miraculous, to be honest.
That's amazing. I love hearing that. And yeah, it's so much hard work from all avenues. It's not only school, it's also home. You reached out to a fellow educator, a friend, willing to put the time in 4 days a week. Total props to you, because yeah, that takes a lot of diligence, takes a lot of hard work, and even feeling frustrated or overwhelmed, like just pushing through that and being like, no, I know there's hope. We're just going to keep going, because I know that this, like you said, early intervention is so key. Okay, so I know that you've said that educators are not necessarily trained in dyslexia. And so it would be helpful not only for educators listening, but also parents, if you can share a little bit about what signs an educator or a parent might be looking for, or what red flags would be going on.
Even, dyslexia can be diagnosed accurately as young as like 5.5, I believe is what I've read. And, looking back now, I realize that my son had a lot of kind of red flags that I just didn't know to recognize. Because dyslexia is a language-based difference. Okay, so it has nothing to do with intelligence. It has nothing to do with, your vision, but it's a difference in the language processing in the brain. So kids that have speech and language delays as, toddlers and preschoolers, that can be something to be aware of. And it's not always the case that if you have a speech and language delay that you have dyslexia. That's something to be aware of. I have two kids that both were delayed speakers. Only one of them has dyslexia. So again, that's just something to say, I should be aware of that. Another thing, kids that are really struggling to learn and remember their alphabet, their letter names and letter sounds. That's crucial. It's a risk indicator, being able to name your letters and the sounds that they represent, right? So there are a lot of common misunderstandings about dyslexia. Like the thing that I thought I knew about dyslexia years ago was, oh, doesn't that when they like read backwards or then they mix up their B's and D's? And that is not necessarily a sign of dyslexia. They don't see things backwards, but they do have trouble processing and manipulating sounds and words, right? Because again, it's this language-based learning difference. And then this misunderstanding that kids with dyslexia write their B's and D's backwards, or they might see a B and say the sound D, right? Instead, or switch those up, or even P and Q. But if you think about it, if you look at a B, a D, a P, and a Q, they're all the exact same shape, just in a different direction. And what was fascinating to me to learn was that all beginning readers can do that, and it's very common. It's not a red flag at all until they're about 8. Okay, so the thing about mixing up their B's and D's, for example, is that the part of our brain that's actually used for letter recognition is originally there for facial and object recognition. Our brain literally rewires it, kicks that out into the right hemisphere, and that becomes the area in which our brains are now able to recognize letters. Now, for beginning readers, if they haven't fully developed that reading circuit, they will still or can still mix up their B's and D's, right? So that's just a common misunderstanding that I had that same misunderstanding myself years ago. So being aware of sound represented by letters, that whole alphabetic principle, if kids are struggling with that concept, phonemic awareness or sound awareness, or if they struggle to rhyme and hear sound, manipulate sound, isolate sounds, like if you were to play little games with your, toddlers and preschoolers, and you were to say, let's say you said the word cat, and you ask them to try and can they tell you what that first sound is in the word cat? Can they hear k, k, k? Can they hear that first sound? Those are really fun things to do with your kids to kind of help them develop that sound awareness. There's so many great like rhyming and word awareness and vocabulary and things like that. And kids that are really struggling with that, that's something to be aware of. Because then when they're going into kindergarten, those are all skills that the teacher's going to hope that they have. And if it's not coming naturally at home, it may not come naturally at school either. So the thing about dyslexia, though, is that there's not like one test that identifies it. And of course, like we hear a lot about dyslexia screeners in kindergarten, which is really just in answer to the fact that, so many kids were being overlooked and were falling through the cracks, right? But it really can't be identified in the absence of instruction. And it's basically like, okay, when we're screening for dyslexia, it really means technically that we're screening for the risk of reading difficulty. So there's a lot of really great standardized, easy screening measures that can be given that are screening for specific foundational literacy skills. So to say, well, we can't really just screen using one test and say, this kid has dyslexia or this kid doesn't. There are assessment measures that can be given to say, okay, you know what, this child is at risk because we just used a standardized measure that is looking at phonemic awareness, and they're below the benchmark where we think they should be. So they need some intervention, and let's see how they respond to that intervention. Or we're giving them a measure that screens for, the alphabetical principle or accuracy and fluency, for example. And if they're falling below where they should be, that tells you, okay, this child needs to have more intervention or maybe intensive intervention.
As you're saying these things, I'm thinking of tests that I would be giving to students. Yeah, like there's certain tests that exactly what you're saying, you'd be giving phonemic awareness tests. And I would have kids even up into 8th grade that maybe they were never diagnosed or never, they'd had an IEP, but it wasn't specific to dyslexia, but they absolutely struggled with that phonemic awareness of if I was saying, okay, I'm going to say a list of words and you repeat it back to me, they wouldn't be saying the same word back to me. And it would be like, where did you hear that from? And it was almost like a guess where they'd be like, I don't know, like, let me just tell you this. So I know you've mentioned
Is that
Thornton Gillingham.
Mhm.
Yes. Okay. So I know you've mentioned it a couple times. So if you can talk about what that is and then share a little bit about what teacher trainings are like when it comes to dyslexia and where they fall short.